On the morning of Sunday, August 5th, 1962, the assembly of Reverend Nathaniel Boone's chapel gathered as they had for decades, dressed in their finest, filling the timber pews, waiting for a sermon that would never be finished. The air was balmy, dense with the scent of aged hymnals and Sunday perfume. The choir had just taken their seats when the first shot rang out. Gasps erupted. A lady shrieked. Reverend Nathaniel Boone stood at the pulpit, his hands still gripping the sides of the podium as his body swayed. A scarlet stain spilled across his chest, blossoming through his starched white shirt. His mouth opened, but no words came, just a choking gasp as his knees buckled beneath him. Then the second shot. His wife, Leah Boone, collapsed before she had time to process what had happened. And standing at the front of the chapel, in full view of the assembly, was the shooter. Not a stranger, not an enemy. His own mom, the lady who had raised him, the lady who had shaped his faith, the lady who had carried a secret so monstrous, so corrosive, that she would rather watch her son bleed out at the pulpit than let the reality be spoken. A secret that had been buried for nearly 4 decades. A secret Jonah had just begun to uncover. And when he decided to speak, she silenced him forever. But what had he learned? Why did his own mom terror the reality so much that she would kill? And how deep did the duplicity run?
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
By the time the service was over, the chapel floor was soaked in gore, and the walls that had hidden generations of sin had finally begun to crack. Because what happened in that chapel wasn't just a slaying, it was the unraveling of a crime that had been in motion long before that gun was ever fired. By the time Camilla Boone turned 59, she was a lady of both reverence and whispers. She carried herself with the grace of a preacher's widow, the kind of lady whose name commanded both respect and quiet speculation in the tiny southern town of Ash Hollow, Mississippi. She was regarded as a pillar of the chapel, a mom of the faith. But there were things about her that were always left unsaid. She was still an attractive lady, even in her late years. Too attractive, some said. For all her outward devotion, for all her years of playing the grieving widow, there was something unsettling about her presence. Women in the assembly would notice the lingering stares of certain men when she passed by. They would exchange quiet glances when she spoke too softly, too familiarly with men who weren't her husband. Because Camilla Boone was no grieving widow. The gentleman she had married, preacher Franklin Boone, had been dead for nearly 4 decades. And while the town had accepted his passing as the work of divine will, there were always those who murmured that his demise had been too convenient. His wife had never truly mourned. She had moved on too quickly, too privately, too comfortably. And now, in the year 1962, she was still moving. There were rumors, of course. A lady as widowed yet untouched as Camilla was bound to have them. Some said she still had a gentleman's company behind closed doors. Some said she had never stopped seeing the gentleman she was seeing before Franklin perished. They weren't wrong. Because Camilla Boone's affair had never ended. And the gentleman she had been entangled with for over 40 years, the gentleman who had stood beside her in the chapel, who had comforted her after Franklin's demise, who had baptized her offspring and laid hands on her in prayer, was none other than Elder Royce Chambers, the very gentleman who had helped her kill her husband. In the late 1920s, Franklin Boone was a gentleman struggling to hold his home together. He had been a respected preacher, a gentleman of faith, a gentleman of discipline, but what he hadn't been was a gentleman who understood the lady he married. He had adored Camilla, but he had never controlled her. She was too independent, too sharp, too restless, and by the time she was 23, she had already betrayed him in the worst possible way. Her pregnancy should have been a blessing, a sign of God's favor upon their marriage. Instead, it was a ticking bomb, because the child growing inside her was not Franklin's. She knew it, Royce Chambers knew it, and eventually Franklin figured it out too. For weeks, the Boone household became a war zone behind closed doors. Franklin wasn't a violent gentleman, but he was not a fool either. The reality was impossible to ignore. His wife had laid down with another gentleman, and now she carried another gentleman's child under his roof. For a Southern preacher in the 1920s, there was no greater humiliation. A divorce would have ended his career. A scandal would have ruined his name. A child that wasn't his own would have made him a walking disgrace. And yet Camilla refused to beg for forgiveness. She did not fall to her knees in shame. She did not weep for mercy. She did not plead for her husband's acceptance. Because she knew something Franklin didn't. She wasn't going to be his wife for much longer. On the night of August 11, 1924, preacher Franklin Boone took his last breath. The official report stated that he perished in his sleep, the cause attributed to an unknown medical condition. The town mourned. The chapel grieved the loss of their spiritual leader. His widow, youthful and heartbroken, received the assembly's sympathy. No one questioned it. No one glanced closer. No one asked why in the days leading up to his demise, he had begun telling people that something wasn't right in his home. No one asked why in the years following his demise, Camilla and Royce never truly stayed apart. For nearly 4 decades, they had kept their crime buried beneath a chapel built on lies. But sins don't stay buried forever. Because the son they had protected, the son they had raised under a false name, the son they had unknowingly married off to his own sister, was about to unearth the reality. And this time, Camilla would not let the past resurface. Not without gore. 4 years after Franklin Boone's demise in 1924, Camilla Boone played the role of a grieving widow perfectly. She stood in the front pew every Sunday, dressed in dignified black, her head slightly bowed as if still carrying the weight of loss. The assembly admired her strength, a lady of God, resilient despite tragedy. But behind closed doors, Camilla had already begun reshaping her world. With her husband gone, she had no intention of living in the shadow of a dead gentleman. She still had her child, the one that wasn't Franklin's but had been forced to carry his last name. She had Royce Chambers, the gentleman she had always wanted, the gentleman who had helped her dispose of her husband like he was nothing more than an obstacle. And she had a chapel willing to follow her lead. For the next decade, Camilla lived without suspicion. She ensured the chapel flourished under her guidance, subtly influencing the men who now took charge, ensuring they never glanced too deeply into the past. And as for Royce, he never officially moved into her home, but there was no need. Their affair never ended. It only became more strategic, careful, calculated, controlled. Until 1926, when everything threatened to crumble again. The birth of Evelyn Chambers was an unexpected complication. Royce, now married to a quiet lady named Hazel, had tried to leave Camilla behind, at least on the surface. He had taken a proper wife, a lady untainted by crime, a lady whose innocence made him appear respectable. But Camilla never let him go. She was always there, close, watching, and when Royce's new wife gave birth to a daughter, Camilla saw something else. Not a child, a risk. Because now there was another branch of Royce's bloodline living in the same town. Another child who could one day ask the wrong questions. But the town didn't see the tangled mess of duplicity underneath. All they saw were 2 respected families raising offspring in the same chapel. And no one knew that those 2 offspring were siblings. Through the late 1920s and into the 1930s, Nathaniel Boone and Evelyn Chambers grew up together, unaware of the bond they truly shared. They played on the same dirt roads, ran through the same fields, and sat just pews apart during Sunday services. Nathaniel was the son of a widowed preacher's wife, and the chapel saw him as a child destined for greatness. He was raised with discipline, taught to follow in the footsteps of the dad he never actually had. Evelyn, meanwhile, was the daughter of a quiet but respected deacon. She had her mom's grace, her dad's sharp mind, and a future that seemed bright. From childhood, they were tied together, and as they matured, that tie became something deeper. By the early 1940s, as America went to war, they had grown into something no one dared question: youthful love. And while Camilla and Royce watched from a distance, they knew something neither child could ever suspect. That love was a ticking time bomb. Because the moment Nathaniel and Evelyn chose each other, they unknowingly sealed their fate, a fate that would one day lead them to the very pulpit where their lives would be stolen. The Boone Chambers engagement was announced in early 1946, just as the world was adjusting to the aftermath of war. The town rejoiced. The chapel called it a divine union, a blessed event, a marriage to continue the legacy of faith. A youthful preacher's son taking his place at the altar with the daughter of a respected deacon, it was the match the assembly had prayed for. Only two people weren't celebrating. Camilla and Royce knew their offspring's love had outgrown their control. They had let it continue too long, hoping fate would intervene, that Nathaniel would find another lady, that Evelyn would be drawn in a different direction. But fate was not on their side. Neither of them could stop the wedding without raising suspicion. Because why would a mom oppose her son's happiness? Why would a deacon refuse to bless his daughter's union? Why would either of them stop something that seemed so perfect? The answer was simple: they couldn't. So instead, they did the only thing left to do. They watched in silence as their offspring unknowingly walked into a nightmare. The wedding was held in the spring of 1947. The chapel was filled to capacity, a grand event for a town that had nothing but pride in its youthful couple. Nathaniel stood at the altar, his heart pounding with excitement as he watched Evelyn walk down the aisle, completely unaware of what their vows would truly mean. Camilla sat in the front pew, her hands folded, her face composed. Royce stood with the deacons, his jaw tight, his hands steady. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them stopped it. The rings were exchanged, the vows were sealed, and a kiss that should have never happened confirmed their fate. As the chapel clapped and sang, as the town celebrated, the two people who had orchestrated everything for decades sat in silence, knowing that what had just happened was not a blessing. It was a curse. And no matter how much they tried to control fate, they had just locked themselves into a reality that would one day come to light. Because a marriage built on a falsehood can only last so long before the foundation cracks. And when it did, gore would be the price to pay. For nearly 15 years, Nathaniel and Leah Boone lived what the town of Ash Hollow considered a model marriage. Nathaniel had stepped into his dad's shoes, taking over New Zion Chapel as its revered preacher, guiding the assembly with the same authority and devotion they had once seen in Franklin. Evelyn was the perfect preacher's wife, graceful, steady, supporting her husband as he built his legacy. But beneath the polished exterior, beneath the murmured praises and admiring glances, the cracks had already begun to form. And the ones who saw it first were the very people who had spent their entire lives trying to keep the reality buried. Camilla Boone and Royce Chambers knew that every year their offspring stayed together, the risk of discovery grew. And there was only so much they could control. It began with tiny details, things no one else noticed. A photo album left open too long where the resemblance between Nathaniel and Royce was too striking to ignore. A kin gathering where someone made an offhand comment about how Nathaniel had the same mannerisms as Elder Chambers more than his supposed dad ever did. A question asked by an outsider, someone new to town who had no reason to believe anything but the obvious. "Aren't you two related? You look like kin." At first, it was easy to dismiss. Camilla would laugh it off. Royce would shake his head. Nathaniel and Evelyn would ignore it, never having any reason to question the bloodline that bound them together. But the weight of lies has a way of making itself known, even when no one is looking for it. By the time they reached their mid-30s, the tension had started to weave itself into their marriage in ways neither of them could understand. Nathaniel became restless, a feeling he couldn't explain, a sense that something in his existence was misaligned. Evelyn became withdrawn, her warmth slowly dimming, though she could never articulate why. They still adored each other. They still stood beside each other every Sunday morning. But something had shifted, and neither of them knew how to fix it. because neither of them knew what was really wrong. For Royce Chambers, the weight of his sins had always been easy to carry. He had lived nearly 4 decades with gore on his hands, with the reality pressed down beneath the pages of his Bible. He had convinced himself the past was the past, that his secret had been buried so deep it would never be uncovered. Until his own body turned against him. In 1961, at the age of 60, Royce was diagnosed with kidney failure. The doctors gave him less than a year to live, and for the first time in his existence, he felt terror, not of dying, not of leaving behind the pulpit or his kin or the existence he had built, but of what would happen when he was gone. Because he knew Camilla had always been the stronger one. She was the one who could kill and never look back. She was the one who could falsehood, manipulate, and control without breaking. But Royce had never been as sturdy as her. And as his body grew weaker, as the reality of his approaching demise settled in, his mind began to fracture under the weight of everything he had spent a lifetime trying to forget. The dream started first. He would wake up drenched in sweat, the image of Franklin Boone's face staring at him in the dark. Then came the paranoia. He started seeing things that weren't there, the eyes of the assembly watching him too closely, the whispers of judgment following him everywhere. And then came the guilt. The kind that wraps itself around a gentleman's throat like a noose, the kind that whispers, confess, confess before it's too late. And Royce, for the first time, began to listen. Because he was running out of time. And there was one person who deserved to know the reality before he left this earth. His daughter, Evelyn Chambers Boone. Evelyn Boone arrived at the hospital the way any loving daughter would. She sat beside her dad, holding his hand, offering comfort, unaware that the gentleman she trusted had spent his existence lying to her. At first, his words were soft, almost incoherent. The medication had dulled him, but guilt sharpened his focus. "There's something you need to know," he rasped, his tone barely above a whisper. Evelyn leaned in, expecting words of wisdom, of love, of farewell. What she got instead was a nightmare. Royce didn't start at the beginning. He didn't tell her about the affair first, or the betrayal, or even the slaying. He went straight to the part that would shatter her. "You married your brother," he murmured. Evelyn didn't react at first. The words didn't make sense. She blinked, shook her head. "What?" Royce's grip on her hand tightened. His eyes clouded but desperate. "Nathaniel, he's my son." The words hit like a physical blow. Evelyn jerked back as if burned, her heart slamming against her ribs. Her mind fought against it, refused to believe it. It wasn't possible. Nathaniel was a Boone. He was the son of a preacher, the child of a widow. But Royce wasn't done. He told her everything. The affair, the slaying, the lies, the reason Camilla had never stopped watching her. And when he was finished, he watched his daughter crumble in front of him. Evelyn couldn't breathe. Her marriage, her love, her existence, everything she had ever believed in was a falsehood. Her body shook violently as she tried to comprehend it, tried to process the sheer magnitude of what he was saying. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tear the room apart. She wanted to undo everything. But there was nothing to undo. It had already been done. And as the reality settled into her bones, a different kind of clarity took over. Royce had spent his whole existence keeping this secret. He had let her marry her own brother. He had watched her live a falsehood and said nothing. And now, in his final days, he thought he could cleanse himself with a confession. But it was too late. Too late to ask for forgiveness. Too late to pretend that the reality changed anything. Too late to undo the unspeakable sin that had already been committed. Evelyn rose from her chair, her body moving on instinct. She glanced at the gentleman she had once called Dad and realized she no longer recognized him. She didn't say a word. She didn't cry. She simply reached for her purse, pulled out a tiny pocket tape recorder, and pressed stop. At first, she had only wanted to preserve his last words, a keepsake, but now it was evidence. And when she walked out of that hospital room, her dad was still whispering her name, begging her to stay. But Evelyn never glanced back. Because now the reality was hers. And she was going to make sure Nathaniel heard it too. The night Evelyn Boone returned home from the hospital, she moved like a ghost in her own home. She barely registered the familiar walls, the pictures, the furniture she had picked out over the years. Everything felt foreign, tainted, unreal. Her hands trembled as she reached into her purse, pulling out the tiny tape recorder. The device felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of generations of sin. Royce Chambers' tone was still trapped inside, whispering truths that should have never been spoken. And now Nathaniel had to hear them too. Nathaniel Boone sat at the dining table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him, his mind focused on nothing in particular. It had been a long day at the chapel, and he expected the usual evening routine, quiet conversation, a few moments of peace. But when Evelyn stepped into the room, he knew immediately that something was wrong. Her face was pale. Her hands were clenched. Her body carried a stiffness he had never seen before. She didn't speak. She didn't explain. She simply placed the tape recorder on the table, pressed play, and let the confession spill into the silence. Royce Chambers' tone filled the room, weak but clear, shaking but undeniable. And as Nathaniel listened, his entire world collapsed. At first, he didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't react. The words made no sense. The reality was too big, too grotesque, too impossible. His wife, his love, his partner, the lady he had built an existence with, was his gore. His dad, the gentleman he had spent his existence honoring, wasn't his dad at all. His mom, the lady who raised him, guided him, molded him, had lied to him from the moment he was born. Everything, his marriage, his faith, his identity, was a falsehood. His hands clenched the table so hard his knuckles went white. He wanted to scream, but there was no sound that could capture the horror inside him. He wanted to run, but there was nowhere left to go. Instead, he turned to Evelyn, his eyes wild, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. This can't be true. But she only stared back at him, her own grief a reflection of his own. I recorded every word, she murmured. And just like that, he knew. There was no escape, no rewriting this, no erasing the reality. And that's when the rage set in. Nathaniel stormed out of the home, his heartbeat roaring in his ears. His feet moved without direction, his body fueled by something he couldn't contain. He had to confront her. He had to see her face. He had to make her say it to his face. By the time he reached Camilla Boone's home, the sun had long since set and the air was dense with the weight of the coming storm. He pounded on the door, his fists slamming against the wood like gunfire in the night. The door creaked open, and there she was. His mom. The lady who had spent his entire existence shaping him into a falsehood. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look afraid. She only glanced tired, as if she had known this moment would come. When she finally spoke, her tone was calm. Go home, Nathaniel. But he didn't move. He stood there, shaking with rage, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I know everything, he said, and you're going to answer for it. For the first time, Camilla's expression shifted, a flicker of something. Not terror, but something close to it. Because she knew. This wasn't over. Not yet. Nathaniel Boone had always believed that God's justice was greater than gentlemen's. But standing in front of his mom that night, betrayal suffocating him, he realized there were some sins that no divine mercy could erase. Camilla Boone, the lady who had raised him, shaped his faith, his morals, his very identity, was a fraud. She had built her entire existence on duplicity. She had killed a gentleman to protect her truths. She had let him marry his own gore. And when he came to her demanding answers, she had barely flinched. She had not denied it. She had not begged for forgiveness. She had not even pretended to be ashamed. Instead, she stood in the doorway of her home, her face calm, her tone cool and steady. "Go home, Nathaniel." But he didn't leave. And the longer he stood there, the more he realized what had to be done. "You lied to me," he said, the words slow and deliberate, filled with a venom he had never spoken before. Camilla's lips pressed into a thin line, but she did not deny it. "You let me marry my own sister," he continued, his tone rising with each syllable, rage turning sharp, cutting. "You let us build an existence together while you sat in the front pew knowing the reality the whole time." A long silence stretched between them. Then finally Camilla sighed, tilting her head slightly. When she spoke, her words were colder than he had ever heard them. "You should have never gone looking." Something in Nathaniel snapped. His hands curled into fists. His body trembled with fury. "I'm going to the pulpit this Sunday," he said, his tone shaking with rage. Camilla's breath hitched. Her nails dug into the edge of the doorframe. "I'm going to tell the chapel," he continued, stepping closer. "About you, about Royce, about what you did to my dad." For the first time, Camilla's mask cracked, a flicker of panic, of terror, of realization. Nathaniel saw it. And he knew she wasn't afraid of what the assembly would think. She wasn't afraid of scandal or shame. She was afraid of losing control. Because her entire world was built on the falsehood she had created. And if that falsehood crumbled, so did everything she had spent 4 decades protecting. Nathaniel stormed back home, his gore boiling. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't think. The rage was too loud inside him. Evelyn watched him from across the room, her hands clasped together, her body rigid. "What are you going to do?" she finally asked, her tone barely above a whisper. Nathaniel turned to her, his eyes dark with determination. "I'm going to tell the reality." The words were simple, final, absolute. Evelyn's throat tightened, because she knew this wasn't just about the reality anymore. This was about power, about control, about a lady who had killed once before and might do it again. Camilla Boone would never let herself be exposed. And if Nathaniel was going to stand in front of the chapel this Sunday, he was giving her only one option. She had to silence him before he could speak. Sunday morning in Ash Hollow had always been predictable. The people of New Zion Chapel, dressed in their finest, gathered in the pews and listened as their preacher delivered the Word of God. But on August 5, 1962, the assembly was unaware they were about to witness a slaying. The chapel was filled to capacity, voices humming with anticipation. There had been whispers all week, something about preacher Nathaniel Boone behaving differently, something about tension that hadn't been there before. But no one could pinpoint why. Camilla Boone sat in her usual place, front pew, spine straight, hands folded in her lap. Her expression betrayed nothing. To anyone watching, she was simply a widowed preacher's wife, a devoted lady of faith. But inside her mind, the decision had already been made. Nathaniel had given her no choice. He had spent the past few days preparing. His sermons had been rewritten. His mind was made up. He had paced the floors of his home, rehearsing the words that would shatter the world around him. The reality could no longer be contained. Not when his entire existence had been built on a falsehood. Evelyn Boone had been watching him closely, feeling the weight of what was coming. She had tried to mask her dread, but it was there, in the way she moved, the way her fingers trembled when she adjusted her hat that morning. She had already heard the reality, already played the recording, already felt the slow decay of the existence she thought she knew. But today the world would hear it too. Nathaniel stepped onto the pulpit, a place he had stood for years. A place where his dad had once preached before him. The Bible lay open before him, his notes tucked carefully between the pages. The assembly settled in, waiting. And Camilla, still in the front row, tightened her grip around the object inside her purse. The air inside the chapel felt different, charged with something no one could name, but everyone could feel. Nathaniel was about to speak, and Camilla was about to stop him. The sermon began like any other, a slow and steady rhythm, the kind that built towards something greater. But today, Nathaniel's words carried an edge, a weight, a purpose no one had heard before. He spoke of reality, of duplicity, of sins that could no longer be hidden. Camilla's heartbeat quickened. The moment had arrived. Her son was about to expose everything, her affair, the slaying, the falsehood that had stretched across decades. He was about to speak the words that would ruin her. She reached into her purse. The first shot echoed through the chapel, ripping through the air with a force that sent the assembly into chaos. A moment of frozen silence followed. Nathaniel staggered back, his hand gripping the edge of the podium, his body jerking as gore bloomed across his chest. His mouth opened, but no words came. The second shot rang out before anyone could scream. Evelyn collapsed beside him, her body hitting the pulpit floor before she even had time to understand what had happened. The chapel erupted in screams. Voices rose, footsteps pounded, pews scraped against the timber floor as people scrambled for safety. And standing there in the center of it all, her pistol still raised, her hands steady, her breath unshaken, was Camilla Boone. She had done what needed to be done. Her son would not ruin her. Her past would not be unearthed. Her lies would not be exposed. But as the assembly turned toward her, horrified, stunned, frozen in disbelief, Camilla finally felt it. The weight. The silence. The crushing realization that despite everything, the reality was still coming for her. Because two people lay dead at her feet. And the chapel would never be the same again. Gun was still balmy in Camilla Boone's hand when the first voices finally rose above the shock. For a moment, the chapel had been frozen, a room full of people paralyzed by the horror of what they had just witnessed. Then the screams came. Women clutched their offspring. Men scrambled for cover. Some rushed toward the pulpit, others toward the doors, their instincts split between witnessing history and escaping it. Nathaniel Boone lay crumpled at the base of the pulpit, gore pooling around him, his white Sunday shirt soaked in red. His Bible still open had been splattered with the reality he never got to speak. Evelyn's body slumped beside him, her breath already gone, her existence ended before she could even make sense of what was happening. And standing over them, her revolver still raised, her face like stone, was Camilla Boone. The first to move was Deacon Solomon Wren, a gentleman who had served under Nathaniel's dad before him, a gentleman who had known Camilla for over 40 years. He rushed forward, hands raised, tone trembling, his body blocking her from firing another shot, even though it was clear she had no other targets left. Men surged forward, forcing the gun from her hand, the metal clattering to the timber floor. She did not resist. She did not cry. She did not speak. The assembly watched in disbelief as two men grabbed her by the arms, pulling her away from the pulpit, away from the bodies of the son and daughter-in-law she had just executed. The doors burst open. Someone had already run to the sheriff's office. The authorities arrived faster than anyone could have expected, perhaps because the town had already sensed something was wrong before the first shot was even fired. Sheriff Clay Redford stepped inside, his hat clutched in one hand, his revolver still holstered. He took one look at the scene before him, the gore, the bodies, the gun lying abandoned on the floor, and knew there was no need for a trial to determine what had happened. Camilla was guilty. She did not resist when they placed the cuffs around her wrists. She did not flinch when they led her through the doors of the chapel, past the assembly she had once commanded with nothing more than her presence. She walked with the same dignity she had always carried. But dignity meant nothing when you were walking toward a cell that would soon become your tomb. At the police station, the weight of the crime began to settle. Gore had been spilled inside God's home. A preacher had been slain on the very pulpit where he was meant to preach salvation. A wife had perished for nothing more than being in the way of the reality. And now a mom sat in a cold interrogation room, her hands folded, her lips pursed, her eyes revealing nothing. But even as Camilla sat in silence, the past had already begun to unravel. Because her son may have perished before he could speak, but the reality had already been recorded. And while she had killed 2 people that morning, the one thing she had feared most, the secret she murdered to protect, was still alive. Evelyn Boone's purse had been found at the scene. Inside was a tiny portable tape recorder. And inside that recorder, Royce Chambers' confession was waiting to be heard. Camilla had silenced her son. But she had not silenced the past. And now there was nowhere left to hide. The courtroom was silent, packed from wall to wall. The trial of Camilla Boone had drawn in every soul in Ash Hollow, those who had once admired her, those who had once feared her, and those who now saw her for what she truly was, a murderer, a liar, a lady who had built her existence on duplicity, her chapel on a grave, and her legacy on a crime so dark it had finally swallowed her whole. She sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped, her posture as regal as ever. Even now she refused to bow. But it no longer mattered. Because her past was speaking for her. The tape recorder was played in open court. For the first time, the entire town heard Royce Chambers' confession, the truths that had festered in the shadows for 40 years, the reality that Camilla had tried to bury with 2 bullets inside her son's chest. The jury listened as his weak, rasping tone filled the room. The affair that led to Nathaniel Boone's birth. The slaying of Franklin Boone in 1924. The years of duplicity that followed. The marriage between 2 people who never should have been husband and wife. The reality that, once exposed, left Camilla no choice but to kill. A courtroom sat in stunned silence. And for the first time since her arrest, Camilla's expression cracked. Because now the whole world knew. Outside the courthouse, the chapel was in ruins. Not physically. Its walls still stood, its blotched glass windows still gleamed under the Mississippi sun, but its foundation had crumbled. The assembly had splintered overnight. Some refused to believe the reality, unable to reconcile the lady they had once revered with the reality of who she was. Others turned their backs completely, disgusted that they had followed a lady who let them pray inside a home built on gore. The Boone name, once tied to faith, now belonged to a scandal that would never be forgotten. And as the people of Ash Hollow moved forward, one thing became clear. There would never be another Boone behind that pulpit. The chapel would never recover. And Camilla had not just murdered her son that day. She had murdered everything she had ever tried to build. The trial ended swiftly. The jury found Camilla Boone guilty of 2 counts of first-degree slaying. The sentence, existence in prison. She did not cry. She did not beg. She did not speak. She only stood when she was told to stand, walked when she was told to walk. She was removed from the courtroom in silence, her hands shackled, her future reduced to the confines of a prison cell. For the first time in many years, Camilla Boone had no power, no control, no way to manipulate what happened next. Her story was over, but the damage she had done would never fade. Nathaniel Boone and Evelyn Chambers were buried side by side. A tragedy that never should have happened. A love that had been stolen by the sins of a generation before them. Their graves lay under the shade of an aged oak tree, the headstones freshly carved, their names forever linked, not by marriage, but by gore. The town murmured about them for years. How the preacher who had once led them had been living a falsehood. How the lady he had adored had been his sister. How the mom who raised him had been the one to end his existence. And as the years passed, the story became a cautionary tale. A murmured warning. A legend told behind closed doors. Because in the end, Camilla Boone had spent her entire existence trying to hide the reality. And all it took was a dying gentleman's confession and 2 bullets in a chapel to drag her sins into the light.